The tank came down the valley in the dark, and Hank Mercer knew the sound of it the way a man knows the voice of a thing that has already killed someone he loved. It ground toward the wire on squealing tracks, the infantry coming on behind it in the dust. He laid the new launcher on his shoulder, settled the sight on the flat of its hull, and waited for it to come close. The last time, his rocket had struck a tank like it and bounced off like a stone. Not this time. It was the most desperate summer of the war, and every man in that valley could feel the whole thing balanced on a knife's edge. Since June, it had been one long falling back. The North Koreans had come across the border with their Russian tanks and their hard veteran infantry, and driven the South Koreans and the thin first ranks of Americans down the length of the country until there was almost nothing left to give. By August, the line had been bent into the last corner of the peninsula, a shrinking box of hills and paddies with the Noktong River at its back, and beyond that, the port of Pusan and the sea. There was nowhere else to go. Their army commander, Walker, had said it about as plainly as a general could that summer. No more retreating, no more ground traded for time, because there was no more ground. Stand here or lose the war. The hinge of all of it just then was a city called Taegu, the forward base of the whole 8th Army, its railhead and nerve center, the door through which everything flowed up to the line. North of the city, the mountains pinched the roads to a few narrow corridors, and down one of them, a long straight valley, the North Koreans were trying to force their tanks. Take the valley, and the road to Taegu lay open. Take Taegu, and the line would unzip from the inside and the whole box would come apart. So a handful of men were sent to hold a stretch of valley road north of a village called Tabu-dong, because that nothing-looking strip of dirt was, that week, the most important ground on earth. They held it with the 27th Infantry, the Wolfhounds. When the line cracked somewhere and a hole had to be plugged before morning, it was the 27th that got thrown into the gap. Fire Brigade, the Army called them, and they wore the name with grim pride, because it meant they were always moving toward the trouble and never away from it. They had spent the first part of the month down south, holding the line in the hills near Pusan, and had just been pulled back into reserve when the word came to move north, fast, because the South Korean division in the mountains above the city was coming apart and the road behind it was about to fall open. The valley they came to was a strange, beautiful, terrible place. A single road ran north up the floor of it, straight as a ruled line for a long stretch, lined both sides with tall poplars, a shallow stream chattering alongside. Mountains rose sheer on either hand, 2,000 and 3,000 feet, so the road and the stream lay along the bottom of a deep stone trough. By day it was almost lovely. By night it became the thing the men named with the black humor of soldiers, because when the shooting started, the tracers came skipping and ricocheting down that long straight lane, streaks bowling away into the dark, tank rounds glancing off the road and shrieking away end over end, for all the world like the inside of a bowling alley. So that was what they called it, the bowling alley. It lay 13 miles north of the city, and it might as well have been the only 13 miles in Korea that mattered. Hank Mercer was 24, a corporal, and the best rocket gunner in his company. He was from the Panhandle country, the flat, hard edge of Oklahoma, where the dust had come in the 30s and never wholly left. He had been a boy when the dusters rolled the topsoil up into black mountains in the sky and buried the fences, and he had watched his father stand on the porch of a foreclosed farm and look at a sky the color of a dirty penny and say nothing, because there was nothing to say. The other men hated the dust of a Korean August, the fine ochre powder that rose off the road under every boot and track and shell and caked in the sweat on a man's neck. Mercer did not hate it. It was an old companion, and when it hung red over the valley in the evening, he felt something almost like home. He was watchful and patient and quiet, which was the making of a good gunner. A rocket gunner had to be able to be still, to let the thing come and come until he could not miss, then do everything right with the steel bearing down on him. Mercer could hold still better than anyone. He had always been able to. Until July. July was the thing he carried, and it had a face, and the face was Augie's. August Petrak had been his loader and his closest friend, a wide-shouldered, cheerful kid from the Pennsylvania coal patches who could make a joke out of anything and had loaded Mercer's launcher since the troopship over. In those first weeks, the only launcher the Army had given them was the old one. The 2.36-inch, the little stovepipe left over from the last war, and the rockets that came with it were old too, gone soft and dead from years in damp depots. Nobody knew that yet. They only knew what happened when they used them. It was on a road in the worst of the falling back, a white-hot morning. The company strung out thin and the North Koreans coming on. A T-34 came grinding down the road at them, one of the big Russian tanks with the long 85mm gun, the kind of machine that had rolled over everything in its path all summer. Mercer did what he had been trained to do. He let it come close, closer than he wanted, his mouth dry as dust, Augie at his shoulder with a rocket in the tube and a hand on his helmet. He laid the sight on the flat steel front of the thing and fired, and the rocket flew straight and true and struck at dead center and bounced off. A puff and a clang and a streak of smoke spinning away, the warhead too old and dead to bite, and the tank came on as if nothing had touched it. Augie rammed another rocket home and Mercer fired again, and it was the same, nothing, a wasted streak, the corroded thing failing even to go off, and the tank rolled over their position with its machine gun going, and it took Augie, and there was not one thing on God's earth Hank Mercer could do about it. He had had the killer dead in his sights at 30 feet twice, and his weapon had failed him, and the steel had taken his friend and ground on south and left him kneeling in the dust with the wreck of a launcher in his hands, and nothing in him but a great cold roaring helplessness. That was the wound, not the dying. There had been so much dying that summer. It was the helplessness of it. The thing right there in front of him, and nothing in his hands that could touch it. Then in August, the new launchers came up to the line, and everything changed. They came packed in sealed moisture-proof tubes. The rockets kept dry from the wet that had killed the old ones. Longer and heavier than the stovepipe. The 3.5-inch. Already the men were calling it the super bazooka. And the word that came with them was almost too good to believe. This one would kill a T-34. It would punch a hole clean through the front of one and gut it where it stood. Mercer did not let himself believe it all the way, because he had believed in a launcher once, and a man had died for it. But he cleaned the new weapon and kept it spotless the way the manual screamed, "You must," and weighed the heavy sealed rockets in his hands, and somewhere under the wariness a small dangerous thing began to stir that he was almost afraid to name. The thing was hope, that the next time the steel came, he would not be helpless. They gave him a new loader to go with it. His name was Sammy Oakes, 18, up 3 weeks before as a replacement. Green as spring grass, a logging town boy from the wet green corner of Oregon, and the dust of Korea astonished him, a country dried to such cracking dust. Mercer had not wanted him, had not wanted another loader, another man's jokes and hometown and the name of his girl. Not at that weapon, not where the last one had been taken. But the kid was his, eager and frightened and quick with his hands, and against every wish of his own heart, Mercer began to teach him how to seat the rocket and hook the firing wire and slap the gunner's helmet to say up and ready, how to keep clear of the backblast, how the two of them had to move as one animal, because a gunner was only as alive as his loader kept him. And one evening, with the boy jumpy at the guns walking somewhere off in the mountains, Mercer told him the only thing he had to give. "You stay on this weapon with me and do exactly what I tell you, and I'll get you out of this valley," he said. "That's all you've got to think about." He made the promise the way he had long since stopped letting himself make promises, knowing he had no right to it, knowing the war honored nothing. He made it anyway. It seemed to him that if he could just bring this one boy through, stand at the same tube where the steel had beaten him, and this time keep the man beside him alive, then maybe the helplessness would finally let go. By day, the valley belonged to the men in their airplanes, the Mustangs and the gull-winged Corsairs snarling down the trough to burn the North Korean tanks out of the high slopes with napalm, the men cheering each fist of black smoke. But the airplanes went home with the light. And the night, every night, belonged to the tanks. The men had made the valley as ready as men could. Out front, across the road and the stream bed, they had strung 2 belts of mines and trip flares end to end, so anything coming down the lane in the dark would walk into them and light itself up. Behind the dug-in riflemen with their Garens and their Brownings, the Pershings waited. The new M26 tanks, squat and heavy, hull down off the road with their long 90mm guns laid straight up the valley, guns that could finally meet a T-34 as an equal. Far back the howitzers stood ready, their fire registered up and down that road to the yard, so a man on a radio had only to call and a wall of shells would fall on any stretch of the lane he named. Mercer and Sammy had their position near the road with a new launcher and a bag of fresh rockets, and as the dusk came down red with dust, they settled in to wait. Mercer made the boy eat a cold can he did not want, and kept his own voice flat and ordinary, because a steady voice in the dark was worth more than ammunition. The North Korean guns opened a little before midnight, the way they did every night. The barrage came down on the line first, mortars and artillery walking up and down the valley floor, and there was nothing to do but press into the dirt and wait to learn whether the next one had your name on it. The poplars came apart, the ground jumped, dust and stone rained down, and the boy pressed in tight against Mercer's side and shook, and Mercer put a hand on the back of his neck and held it there and waited it out, because he could wait out anything. And then the shelling lifted, the way it always did just before they came, and into the ringing quiet came the engines. They came down the straight road in the dark, the T-34s, grinding and squealing, and behind and around them the infantry came on foot and packed in trucks, rank behind rank, pouring down the lane between the mountains. The lead tank came on slow, buttoned up, feeling its way, its machine gun hosing the dark almost at random, because the enemy could see the dug-in positions no better than the defenders could see them. Then the valley lit up all at once. The trip flares caught and burned white. The mines began to go off out front under the infantry. The Pershings opened from behind with a noise like the sky tearing, the 90mm guns reaching down the lane, and a T-34 took a round square on and began to burn, throwing red light up the trough. The howitzers came down on a called fire mission, the registered wall of them dropping among the following infantry, and the whole valley became the thing it was named for. Tracers and ricochets, streaking down the long straight lane, the burning steel, glanced-off rounds screaming away into the mountains, a terrible bowling alley light flickering on the walls of stone. And then one of the tanks came for them. It had gotten down past the burning one, off the road and slewing toward the company's holes, coming on at Mercer's stretch of the line. Long gun traversing, tracks throwing dust, machine gun raking the dark, and Hank Mercer looked at it through the flare light and knew it. Not that tank, that one had ground on south and gone, back in July, but its brother. The same flat steel front, the same long gun, the same kind of machine that had taken Augie and that he had not been able to touch. It was coming on, and the boy was shouting something at his shoulder, and the old, cold helplessness rose up in him out of July like floodwater. And then it did not take him, because this time the thing in his hands was not the stovepipe with its dead rockets. This time it was the new launcher, and the rocket in the tube was fresh and sealed and true. He did what he was made to do. He made himself be still, still in the heart of all of it, the way he had always been able to be still, and let the tank come, closer than any sane man would, until he could see the rivets and the worn places on the steel, until it began to turn across his front and gave him the long flank of itself. "Up!" the boy shouted, slapping his helmet, rocket seated, wire hooked, backblast clear. And Mercer laid the sight on the side of that thing, on the very steel that had made him helpless, and fired. The rocket crossed the few yards of dark and struck the tank on the flank, and it did not bounce. Heh! It bit. The warhead punched through the steel as if it were paper, a hard white flash and a deep ringing crack, and the tank shuddered and slewed and stopped, smoke pouring up out of its hatches, and it sat dead in the dust of the valley floor. It was dead. He had killed it. The thing that could not be touched, the steel that had taken his friend and left him kneeling helpless in a road, he had put a rocket clean through it, and something in Hank Mercer's chest that had been clenched shut since July came open all at once. Sammy had a fresh rocket in the tube before the first tank finished dying, and they swung onto another, and Mercer fired again, and that one died too. And then it was true, all the way true. The steel could be killed. The terror that had ridden every man in that army all summer was a lie now. It could be stopped, by a steady man, and a good loader, and a fresh rocket. And tonight, Hank Mercer had both. But the valley took its price the way it always did, and it took it close. The tanks could be killed now, But the infantry still came, and the fighting along the line went hand to hand in the flicker of the burning steel. Close, ugly work in the holes, men too near to aim, the crack of grenades, the hammer of the Brownings. Sergeant Tully went up and down the line, hauling men into position, holding the thing together with his voice, and a burst caught him across the leg and dropped him into a hole, swearing, alive but finished for the night. Down the road, the other launcher team, Phil Daybeck and his loader, were killing tanks too. Mercer had heard their rockets going, a second hard voice in the dark, and then a tank's machine gun found them in the open as they shifted, and Daybeck's launcher went silent and did not start again. Mercer heard it stop and knew what the stopping meant, and there was no time to feel it. There was never any time. And then the steel came one more time for his own hole. A last tank lunging out of the smoke straight at the position where he and the boy crouched. Too fast and too close, and this was the whole of July turned over and handed back to him. Last time he had knelt helpless while the steel took the man beside him. Not this time. He did not freeze, and he did not run. He dropped to the gun, and the boy, white-faced, steady now, schooled, had the rocket seated and the wire hooked and slapped his helmet. Up, and Mercer laid the sight on the thing bearing down on them both, and put a rocket through the front of it at a range where no man could miss, and it died almost on top of them, slewing to a halt in a gout of smoke a stone's throw from the hole, close enough they felt the heat of it roll over them, and the boy was still there, still beside him, alive. He had stood at the tube where the steel beat him once, and this time the steel had died and the man beside him had lived, and that was a thing Hank Mercer had not been sure he would ever get to do. By the gray of first light, it had gone quiet, the wrung-out quiet that comes after a night like that one, and Mercer lifted his head and looked at what the valley had become. It was a graveyard of steel. Down the length of the bowling alley, the T-34s stood dead and burning, black hulks slumped on the road and in the stream bed, hatches gaping, thin, oily smoke standing straight up in the still dawn air. The poplars were shattered to splinters. The mine belts and the howitzers and the Pershings had all done their work, and the armored fists the North Koreans had driven down that lane in the dark lay wrecked and smoking in the dust. They had not gotten through. The city was still there, 13 miles south, holding. The men came up gray out of their holes and counted themselves, and carried the wounded down toward the rear, Tully among them, cursing and alive, and gathered up the ones who would not be walking down at all, Daybeck among those, and the dust drifted slow over all of it, steel and men alike. They held the corridor. Over a week of those nights they held it, until the North Korean division that had spent itself against that valley was broken past mending, and the great drive to take the city died there in the trough of the bowling alley among the burned-out tanks. Mercer did not know it yet, but the long falling back was nearly over. Within a few weeks, the landings far up the coast at Incheon would tear the whole enemy front open from behind, and the retreat that had run since June would turn at last and start the other way. He only knew that they had held one more night, and that the thing he had carried since July had been set down. There would come a time in that war, he could not have known it, but it was coming, when the front would freeze and the fighting would shrink to a string of bald little hills with numbers for names, ground that meant nothing at all, where men would be spent for a worthless hump of dirt so diplomats could make a point across a table. He would have understood that war and hated it. But this was not that ground. This valley was the door the whole line swung on, the 13 miles between the enemy and the city and the sea, and the dirt he had bled for here bought the time that saved the war. For once the ground had been the thing itself. For once it had been worth every yard. Sammy Oakes stood beside him in the smoking dawn, filthy and shaking and 18 and alive, the rocket bag still over his shoulder. Mercer got to his feet, his knees stiff, the new launcher across his arms, and looked back up the long straight valley at the dead steel cooling in the dust. The thing that had killed his friend, that had made him helpless, the steel nothing in his hands could touch. It lay dead in the dirt of a place that had been worth the holding, and he had been the one to kill it, and the boy beside him was still breathing. He had been handed at last the means to fight back against the thing that beat him, and he had not wasted it. Augie was gone, and would stay gone. That would not change. But the helplessness had burned out of him in the night like a tank out of its hole, and it was not coming back. The steel lay dead in the dust, and the dust was the one thing in all that country he had always understood. This time, the steel had not won.